Good evening. I'm Marjorie Schuster, and on behalf of the Temple Emanu-El Streicker Center, I am thrilled to welcome you for an evening in celebration of one of the greatest Jewish composers of all time, a man whose hallelujah has been sung in every world language and continues to stir the hearts of millions across this planet. 5 years ago this week, we lost the bard of modern Judaism, whose last album ended with the final words of our ancient chant, Hineini, here I am. We, of course, wish that he were here with us. Since he's not, we are honored to spend an hour or so honoring his memory with Marcia Paley, author of the new book, From This Broken Hill I Sing to You. Dr. Paley, who teaches at NYU, Fordham, and Humboldt universities, and she's also the author of 3 prior books on theology, sacrifice, and American evangelism. She will be in conversation with Rabbi Mordechai Finley, co-founder of the Or Torah Synagogue in LA, who was Leonard Cohen's rabbi, and Dr. Moshe Halbertal, an Israeli philosopher and writer who teaches both at the Hebrew University and at NYU. Please join me in welcoming our guests and in remembering Leonard Cohen.
Hey everybody, this is Rabbi Mordechai Finley. I'll be serving as the moderator tonight for our conversation on Dr. Marcia Paley's really fabulous book. But first we're going to hear from 2 young musicians whose mission is to bring the music of Leonard Cohen to members of their generation. So here are Judah S. Goldman and Jose D. Cruz of the New York-based alternative folk rock band, Dr. Ted and the Stone, with a short clip of You Want It Darker, one of Leonard Cohen's last and most deeply moving songs.
Now if you are the dealer, let me out of the game. If you are the healer, that means I'm broken and lame. That's the glory, I must be the shame. You want it darker? Hineini, Hineini. Hineini, Hineini. I'm ready, my lord.
Thank you so much for that spirited and beautiful rendering of Leonard's song. I know he would have loved it. That was Judah Goldman and Jose D. Cruz of Dr. Ted and the Stone, their rendering of You Want It Darker. We're now going to have Marcia Paley introduce a few words of her book. I just want to say, upon reading it, I realized very soon that it was a tremendous contribution to religious thought, especially in theology, especially the area of theodicy, God's justice. I mentioned to Dr. Paley that I wish I had that book with me in rabbinical school. It would have been a great help. It's a tremendous and original contribution to the world of theology, clearly literary analysis and the study of poetry, and also clearly a fine, superb addition to the understanding of the great poet and psalmist of our generation, Leonard Cohen. So Dr. Pally, we'd love to have you introduce your book to us.
Thank you very much. And thanks to everybody at the Streicker Center for making this evening possible. And thanks to Moshe Halbertal for writing an exquisite preface to the book and for being here this evening as well. I'm just going to plunge in and give a sort of overview of the key themes from this Broken Hill. Soothsayer, poet, musician, and to some rabbi, Leonard Cohen, died 5 years ago on November 7th. But Cohen's importance goes beyond commemorating an artist of evocative song and poetry. You know, Lou Reed said, if we could all write songs the way Leonard Cohen does, we would. In verse and prose, Cohen gave voice to a theology of how the world works and of the consequences when we violate its foundational structure. In short, he explained how we got to the loss, loneliness, poverty, and violence we see around us. Cohen was a serious student of the Buddhist and Sufi traditions, but his theistic beliefs were Jewish. As he said in 1997, I was always happy with the religion I was born into, and it satisfied all the religious questions. It was these religious questions that gave Cohen his understanding of the world's foundation. We live in a relational universe and are covenantal creatures. We become who we uniquely are through our covenantal relationships with the transcendent, which Cohen called God, and with each other, importantly for Cohen, with women. Cohen thought of women sexually and in the Kabbalist tradition as portals to spiritual oneness with the divine. To the extent that we jettison, abandon, or transgress these commitments in our personal or political lives, we undermine the workings of the world, and no good comes of that. Cohen expressed his understanding of our need relationship with God, perhaps most movingly in the 1984 Book of Mercy. Book of Mercy is Tehillim, Cohen's modern Book of Psalms. We are made to lift up my heart to you, God, travel on a hair to you, go through a pinhole of light, and fly on the wisp of remembrance to you. In turn, Please Don't Pass Me By illustrates our simultaneous bonds with other people. I brushed up against the man in front of me. I felt a cardboard placard at his back. It said, please don't pass me by. I am blind, but you can see I've been blinded totally. Please don't pass me by. Passing others by precludes seeing and seeing to them. It forecloses attending to our connection. It makes us blind, and no flourishing comes of that. As for Cohen and women, there's a trove. From Suzanne in his first song collection, and you want to travel with her, and you want to travel blind, and then you know that you can trust her, for she's touched your perfect body with her mind. From body to mind, an idea, as biographer Sylvie Simmons wrote, that was on Cohen's first album and on every album since, including the posthumous song collection, Thanks for the Dance, in 2019, where Cohen wrote, I loved your face, I loved your hair, your t-shirts and your evening wear. As for the world, the job, the war, I ditched them all to love you more. All this devotion, and yet, though we are made for relationship, Cohen knew that we breach relationship in our daily, in our personal and political lives. Inconstancy, betrayal, abandonment, self-interest, and self-protection are the human condition. Cohen was unable to stay constant to God and so find peace with himself. He stayed no more constant to the women he loved. Fearful of being subsumed by relationship, of the intactness of the self being punctured by the exposure and neediness of intimacy, he bolted. He was a guy who found even serial monogamy constraining. His biographer, Sylvie Simmons, described Cohen's two favorite things, no strings and an escape clause. Cohen knew himself to be a covenant failer par excellence. I made a date in heaven, he sang, but oh Lord, I've been keeping it in hell. What gets in the way of keeping covenant? Everything human. We think some self-interest is better and safer than the bonds of covenantal involvement. We follow the call of Babylon and Boogie Street, two running themes in Cohen's work. Cohen bonded and bolted with women, love him and leave him, for two reasons. One, fear that women would not give him access when he wanted. He wrote, "But you stand there so nice in your blizzard of ice. Oh, please let me come into the storm." And the second reason, that once given access, women intimacy would overwhelm autonomy, independence, intactness. As Cohen himself put it in a 1988 interview, the condition that most elevates us is the condition that most annihilates us, that somehow the destruction of the ego is involved with love. Or so Cohen feared. In the 1984 Night Comes On, Cohen wrote one of his most self-revealing lines, "I needed so much to have nothing to touch. I've always been greedy that way. To be free of needing to touch, how tempting Hermeticism is." Who's at fault? Why do we yo-yo between covenant and breach? On one hand, Cohen faults himself and humanity. In Avalanche is the story of God's covenantal offer to his children and his sorrow at our forsaking it. In the body of Jesus, for Cohen, an important figure as a fully human being who did not fail covenant. God steps into the avalanche of human life, but is not embraced. He is abandoned. God laments, "You, humanity, say you've gone away from me, but I can feel you breathe. It is your turn, beloved. It is your flesh that I wear." God, having stepped into human flesh to love and secure humanity, hopes still that we will step up and return covenant. Hey, baby, it's your turn. On the other hand, Cohen faults not only humanity, but God. Why did God make us relational and yet so easily able to sever relationship? Why are we so on our own to forsake and be forsaken? Why is each of us out there dangling, as Cohen sang, like a bird on a wire, trying to be free, having, quote, torn everyone who has reached out for me, close quote. Lover, lover, lover encapsulates Cohen's ire at God. He, God, said, "I locked you in this body. I meant it as a kind of trial." Here, God admits that he, author of creation, is the author of our trials. He made us for committed love. It gave us bodies, wandering desires that betray it. What kind of rigged trial is that? What kind of God? Cohen's diagnosis of our political sins continues the covenantal theme. We breach and abandon covenant with others, not only in our personal lives, but along the political paths of our global connectedness. We don't breach covenant to God, lovers, and others in politics in sequence. We do it all at once. God, lovers, others, Cohen's dark trinity. Everybody Knows is exemplary of Cohen's politics. It begins with our betrayals in the political realm. Everybody knows the war is over. Everybody knows the good guys lost. Everybody knows the fight was fixed. The poor stay poor. The rich get rich. Cohen then slithers into the unfaithfulness of love. Everybody knows you've been discreet, but there were so many people you just had to meet without your clothes. Everybody knows. The image of the betraying lover then moves to the betrayed God who was abandoned at Calvary and is discarded again daily. From the bloody cross on top of Calvary to the beach of Malibu, everybody knows it's coming apart. Take one look at this sacred heart before it blows. Everybody knows. We betray God on the cross and on sunny beaches, with the covenant thrice trounced. In politics, love, and faith, the world is ready to blow. Indeed, what bonds remain to hold it together? At the end of his life, Cohen came to no tidy resolution, but perhaps to two things. One, a recognition of the woman behind the desired and feared dazzling icon. And two, some recognition of the entwined covenant with God and with persons, and acceptance of a certain paradox that God made us relational, yet able to break relationship. First, to the woman. In 2006, Cohen told Christine Langlois, "I never met a woman until I was 65. Instead, I saw all kinds of miracles in front of me, the dazzling, unencounterable icon." Langlois continues, "He," Cohen says, "he always loved women, always appreciated what they could do for me, but always saw them through his own urgent needs and desires. Once that started to dissolve," Cohen said, "I began to see the woman standing there." This ability to see his ricochet between desire and retreat, and the erasure that causes of the real woman before him, was owed in part to his relationship with Anjani Thomas, which gave him a glimpse of the female subject, one who is not the object of his desire and ire. A Street, written with Thomas in 2014, introduces for the first time the female I. "You left me with the dishes and a baby in the bath. You're tight with the militias, you wear their camouflage. I guess that makes us equal, but I want to march with you. The party's over, but I've landed on my feet." Here's the woman in her own voice, not a recruit for male needs and fears. Second, to the recognition of the entwined covenant and acceptance of the paradox that God made us relational and yet so easily able to break relationship. His last song collection, You Want It Darker, released 3 weeks before his death, encapsulates the struggle of Cohen's 60 years of writing. I'll focus on the title song, which includes some of Cohen's most outraged ire at God and some of his most unconflicted commitment. Here's a look at the song's refrain from You Want It Darker. "Magnified, sanctified be thy holy name, vilified, crucified in the human frame, a million candles burning for the help that never came. You want it darker, we killed the flame." The first line, "Magnified, sanctified be thy holy name," is recited, among other places, in the Hebrew prayer that mourners say for the dead. Cohen is sarcastic. This is the God we magnify and sanctify, a God who allows vilification and crucifixion and whose help never comes. Why lay our souls in his hands? What kind of inscrutable God wants his world darker, making us his dependent creatures do the dirty work and kill the flame? Yet the second part of the refrain puts an end to Cohen's rage. It turns to openness towards the transcendent. Cohen sings, "Hineini, Hineini, I am here, present, I am ready, my Lord." This is Cohen's pledge to God. It is also Abraham's response to God when Abraham is asked to sacrifice his son Isaac. But it is also Abraham's response to Isaac himself and to the angel who stops the sacrifice that was never to be. Abraham is present to all of them, to the person of Isaac as much as to the divine. The nature of covenant as between person and God, and between persons, between Abraham and Isaac, is why the sacrifice was never to be. Sacrificing Isaac, breaking covenant with him, would not demonstrate Abraham's bond with God. It would end it, as the two bonds are inseparable. Cohen, in invoking this Abrahamic Hineini, assents to the interlocking commitments to God and to persons. On Cohen's view, this is God's creation. There are no other gods, the first and second commandments. The paradox of unsustained covenant must be lived with. There is no other sort of human living. 3 weeks before he died, after a life of ricocheting between bond and breach, Cohen answers God with, "Hineini, I am here, present for you." This is Cohen in relationship, who understands that God is the healer, whom he sought and resisted throughout his life, and that God is now taking him out of it. Thank you.
Dr. Pally, I've read your introduction and it is stunning and I think requires just a moment of quiet so as not to allow the beauty and depth of what you have said to pass us by too quickly. So I want us all just take a breath because you've done something exquisite. Okay, there's my breath. As I shared with you in reading the book, you've gone way past the academic prose of theology and literary interpretation into a lyricism of your own. And it seems to me that you're engaging with the depth of Leonard as a poet has brought forth a poet in yourself. And I'm just wondering if you would agree with that assessment that that studying him opened up something in you that perhaps had not been present.
I think that's unduly kind about my prose, but I will say that I've never sounded better in print than, I suppose, under the influence of Leonard Cohen.
Yeah. Well, what you just wrote, it should be, if this book goes to another edition, I hope that goes as another preface or introduction. Just two more brief things, and then I want to bring Professor Halbertal on. I have certainly any response from you, and then a question for you. I'm so glad you began, you ended your comments with the Akedah, Genesis chapter 22, which is read traditionally on the second day of Rosh Hashanah. There are so many ways to read this, but in the beginning of it, when God says, take Isaac up to the mountain, clearly implying a sacrifice, the reader is shocked because God seems to be violating God's own covenant, that the covenant will continue through Isaac. And then, as it were, God breaks the covenant. And toward the end of the book, when you see Cohen as both a covenant keeper, covenant breaker throughout his life, and then all of a sudden we see the divine as the archetypal covenant breaker. In this, I see Leonard not only as a psalmist, but in a way a prophet, meaning he's trying to take his experience of the divine and prophesy it in the true sense, meaning being a spokesperson, and also here, a spokesperson for the brokenness of God. And I'm wondering what you think about the idea that he's more than the poet, more than the psalmist, in some ways, a spokesperson for the divine breakage.
I think there are many ways to read the Akedah story, the sacrifice of Isaac. In his book, The Philosophy of Israel, Yoram Hazony says, we're reading it wrong. Abraham knew and says twice that the sacrifice is never to be. He says it once to his servants when he says, Isaac and I will come back together. And he says it once to Isaac. And I think that leads us to another possible interpretation, another Dvar Torah about what is going on in the binding of Isaac's story. Why are they going through the motions of the Akedah if in a way they both know that it's a sacrifice that is never to be, because it would violate Abraham's bond with Isaac and thereby end his covenant with God, because the two are together. And we could spend the rest of the hour talking about the Akedah. But I would like to move to your point about, does God break covenant? Certainly at times in his life, Leonard Cohen was frustrated enough with God to blame not only humanity for breaking covenant, but God himself. And I think this is a good place to bring in our short clip of Lover, 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 which has a a strong expression of the extent to which Cohen could be frustrated with God. You know, only believers are frustrated with God. Atheists don't struggle with God. They don't care. But if you think there is a transcendent, whatever that means to you, then you have struggles because the world is so far from a perfect place. So should we hear a few minutes of Lover, Lover, Lover?
Yes, that'd be great.
Father, change my name. The one I'm using now, it's covered up with fear and filth and cowardice and shame. Yeah, lover, 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 come back to me. You're saying lover, 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 come back to me. He said, I locked you in this body. I meant it as a kind of trial. You can use it for a weapon or to make some woman smile. Lover, 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 come back to me. You're saying lover, 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 come back to me.
Thank
That
you.
was abrupt.
That was,
I want to say one thing about that clip, and then I want to really bring in Moshe, because I learned so much from his preface. I wish I'd read his preface before I wrote the book, but he couldn't have written the preface before I wrote the book, but I wish I had. You know, this is him saying, God, you gave me this body, and God says, I meant it as a kind of trial, right? And this is Cohen angry at God. Why did you set us up this way? And he begins by saying, Father, give me another name. I'm covered up with fear and cowardice and shame. Cohen is very well aware that his inconstancies and betrayals and uncertainties and doubts and bolting and loving and leave him, they are his fault and his flaw. And he wants a way out in this song. And God says, I gave you the body as a kind of trial. And Cohen is so angry at the setup. The other thing I love about this song is that it is both a serious conversation with God and a very sexy song. And the Ballet Jazz of Montreal did a gorgeous ballet to this song, which is raw and confronting and very sexy. Okay, Moshe, over to you.
Moshe?
Well, thank you so much. Yes, thank you so much for the book, Marsha. It's a wonderful, moving, and deep book, and for having me here. I know that we started with a theme. Mordechai spoke about the book. The theme of the book is the question of theodicy, right? It's a question of struggling with evil. And if there is a God who's omnipotent and is good, how could there be evil in the world? And that's a haunting question through the history of religious thought. We can mention the Book of Job as the ultimate expression of that pain. And I think one feature that maybe highlights a certain uniqueness to Cohen's struggle with that question which is that he avoids a certain temptation, which is you want to overcome the problem theologically, try to explain away evil, right? Try to show that actually what you think there is evil, it's actually not evil. I think the worst feature of that in the traditional literature is blaming the victim. That's what Job's friends do, right? They tell him, you must have sinned to deserve that. And that's a horrible thing, because not only that the victim has suffered so much, he has to feel also guilty for that, especially in a situation of comforting the mourner. And then there is the other arguments, like the big picture argument. Now, it looks to you evil, but if you look at the big picture, it will look good. And then what philosophers like, to a certain degree, Maimonides or Aquinas and Spinoza, to a certain degree, is saying that actually evil doesn't exist. It's just it's lacking of good. It has no reality. And I think that Cohen has a resistance as someone, as a poet, as a religious voice, as a human, resists that stream very deeply, because in some ways doing away with evil is a form of evil in itself, right? There is an addition of evil by explaining it away. And our task is not to explain it away, but to try to minimize it, right? That's our issue, that's our task in the world. It's not to explain evil away, but to try to minimize it, not to theorize it. And I think part of the power of Cohen's, and Mordechai, who says, here's the kind of the prophetic voice, almost, right? Is that that he would never explain away evil. And he struggles with the real problem, I think, of evil, which is that evil has such power over us in some ways that it could make us fatalistic, withdrawn, seeking for another world somewhere better. Everybody knows this is a book. This is a song. I think the most fatalistic song of Cohen, if I'm right here. I mean, everybody knows that this and that and that and that. The despair that sucks you from the force to struggle with evil. That's the crushing power. And I think Cohen, what's so powerful about him is that he sees the world for what it is. And then I think he said in some interview of his, if I had a credo, right? If I had a credo, and he says, in this famous, in the anthem, the poem anthem, where he says, ring the bells that still can ring, forget your perfect offering. Mm-hmm. There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in, right? So he says, well, we have to try to forget the perfect offering, right? Perfection is a block in the way of trying to do something, trying to understand the world. It's actually thinking about perfection is what removes us from the world. And understanding that through pain, through the vulnerability, through the crack, there is some power that allows you empathy, shakes you from hubris, motivates you to act. And I think in that respect, there is something both so deeply honest about him religiously, and in some ways so deeply Jewish about him, right? That resisting otherworldliness, the kind of the this-worldly pathos of the religious attitude, embracing, right? Embracing in his broken Hallelujah, right? Where he says, I have, this is a very powerful moment, right? I did my best, right? It wasn't much. I couldn't feel, so I tried to touch. I told the truth. That's a very important thing. I told the truth. I didn't come to fool you. I'm not trying to explain away what's wrong in the world. And even though it all went wrong, I will stand before the Lord of Song with nothing on my tongue but hallelujah. This is one of the most powerful prophetic liturgical moments that at least I've encountered in our religious tradition. And it has to do with confronting, being able to affirm brokenness and act in it. It's so powerful about him, I think, as a poet, as a religious person.
If I may, that was beautifully spoken. Moshe, I read your article on Job, Mourner, and you've paraphrased it, and I want to recommend to everybody to look the article up. It's one of the best readings of Job I've ever read. And I think your conclusion that in the question of theodicy, God's justice, we have to stay engaged in that. And as you said here and there, not come to one side or the other, that it's the victim's fault or we don't understand the big picture. So I want to press you a little bit on this. As you know, from my many discussions with Leonard, he truly saw himself as a Lurianic Kabbalist.
Right.
And therefore the divine actually went through a shvira, through a breakage, that we, as being in God's image, come in this breakage. And I see his poetry as, in many ways, speaking different voices of the breakage. And I very much enjoyed your book, Concealment and Revelation. And so I see him as it were, a Kabbalistic mystic prophet who's both revealing his brokenness, but keeping some things back. I'll offer you one thought. When he says everybody knows, sometimes that phrase is a bit ironic. Well, everybody knows, but we also know that everybody's wrong. So as I read much of his poetry, he's both revealing and concealing, partly because he's not only a prophet and poet, because he's a mystic. And I'm wondering if you detect that in Leonard's poetry, that there's, as the title of your book says, it's a process of concealing and revealing.
Right. Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, I would say the following. I mean, I think the Lurianic element of it, the sharing in the brokenness and the understanding of that element in the divine. I would say there is a further feature maybe, which is that, and that relates to what Marcia says very beautifully in the first chapter of the book. In order there to be a world, God has to contract himself, right? He cannot be, the first movement of creation is tzimtzum. And then I would say that anthropologically speaking, the great tzimtzum of God is not a spatial metaphor, that there is a need for a place for the world, but it's a relational idea, which means that God had to create a being that will surprise him, that he doesn't fully control. Because if God would have created a being that he fully controls, there are not going to be relationships. Definitely no love. I mean, let's say if we have a chemical that we can implant on the other to make the other love us, that will be completely unsatisfactory in terms of genuine relationships. So God has to create a being that will ongoingly surprise him. And that's the ultimate, you might say, God's own self-contraction. And in that biblical tradition, right, God all the time expresses it. So I would say the concealed, in that respect, is that even a human is concealed from God in a way that has to do with the fact that there's a free agent here that moves different directions, that it evolves and develops through that relationship, which then encounters God every time in a different mode. So that might be as well a certain deep element of, I would say, the idea of tzimtzum. And then Cohen will ask again and again, is that gift of being so unpredictable worthy of us, right? Have we used it properly, right? Haven't you, God, made a mistake in that act, right? It keeps on coming to that problem again and again. And that's in some ways the deep dilemma of relationship, right? You want a genuine relationship. That means that if it's a genuine relationship, there will be always a threat, you might say, an option of breaking it. Mm-hmm. And an unpredictability inherent in that, right? So it's kind of almost a self-defeating nature of the relational bond that Marsha describes so beautifully in her book. So that's my kind of take on that question.
Really beautifully articulated. By the way, Moshe's article is on academia.edu, posted there. It's very, very easy to find. Marsha, it sounds like Moshe has really spoken to the heart of your book. I'd love you to respond to Moshe.
Well, thank you, Moshe. I always learn a lot from Moshe. The free will requirement of relationship is foundational to covenant. But there's an aspect of it that Cohen rejected, which is the free will theodicy. God had to give us free will because otherwise you don't have a free agent who can freely opt and choose relationship with God or choose righteousness in this world. Therefore, the evil in this world is our fault because we have free will. Sure. And this rather superficial theodicy, which is in 2,000 years of theodicy writings, is something that Cohen recognized just kicks the problem down the block. Okay, why did God make us with the free will that we have? Couldn't he make us with a free will, but within a narrower range of options, so we wouldn't choose such heinous, murderous acts that we perpetrate on each other? After all, if you have a choice between A, B, and C, even if none of them are very awful, you still have free will, technically. So Cohen was not interested in the free will theodicy, in spite of its popularity. I think that he felt, as Moshe said, that struggling to reduce the effects of the temptation of evil is the human task in covenant. That's our part of it, with God and with each other. And that's why I said a few minutes ago, unsustained covenant is something that must be lived with. There is no other human living. Picking right up from what Moshe said. And and I think Leonard Cohen affected and moved and taught so many people because he gave voice to the struggle to deal with our own breaches, be they with the transcendent or with other people. We know we do them. And it's our task to struggle with that. And he gave voice to that. And he could be passionate about God and furious at God. He could be passionate about women and very nasty about women, very nasty about his fears of relationship with women. But he was aware of it and he wrote about it. He knew this was his struggle. And it's good for us that this struggle was in the mind of a poetic genius. And his gift to us is giving us his voice of these struggles. The very famous line, "There's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in." That's the struggle. There is no other sort of human living. And the line that Moshe quoted, "I don't want forget your perfect offering," that's straight out of Amos and Hosea and Proverbs, and where the prophets say, "I don't want your korbanot and zvachim. I don't want your animal sacrifices. Give me justice. Give me righteous relationships between person and God and among persons." And he spent 60 years struggling with his inability to do that and letting us know about it, letting us into the intimacies of his life, him at his nastiest moments about women. For example, there are many satisfying one-night stands. Do you, the lady at home, do you want to be the ditch around the tower? Now that's nasty. And he let us see that, the depth and the difficulty of the struggle. And that's how I think he got to all of us.
I want to share with you something that in my relationship with Leonard, we spoke once about his creative process, and he believes in the bat kol. He believes in a feminine divine voice that spirals down into him. Ruach HaKodesh tzalachat alav, the Holy Spirit descends into him. And he said to me, many people ask me where my ideas come from. And he said, if I knew, I'd go there more often. So he had a sense, this is why as you can hear, the idea of Leonard Cohen as a prophetic character who in the personas that he creates in his poetry, it's as if he's creating different voices of different versions of the brokenness, resulting from, as it were, being possessed by the bat kol, the feminine divine voice that would inspire this this poetry. And so I think it's important to know that at some point Leonard says, I don't write these poems. I'm a channel for these poems.
Yeah, he said, and I quoted him from this Broken Hill, that's something like whatever makes him able to write is some combination of woman, beauty, God, and darkness.
Mm-hmm. That's nice. That's beautiful.
We have another short clip of the remarkable song Everybody Knows. And I'm wondering if we should just let everybody hear a little more of Leonard.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Everybody knows that the dice are loaded. Everybody rolls with their fingers crossed. Everybody knows the war is over. Everybody knows the good guys lost. Everybody knows that the fight was fixed. The poor stay poor, the rich get rich. That's how it goes. Everybody knows. Everybody knows that the boat is leaking. Everybody knows the captain lied. Everybody got this broken feeling, like their father or their dog just died. Everybody talking to their pockets. Everybody wants a box of chocolates and a long stem rose. Everybody knows. Everybody knows you love me, baby. Everybody knows that you really do. Everybody knows that you've been faithful, give or take a little night or two. Everybody knows that you've been discreet, but there were so many people you just had to meet without your clothes. And everybody knows.
Mesmerizing. Thank you so much for presenting that to us. I've seen many questions in the chat. One did ask, when he was working on You Want It Darker and the Yitkadal V'Yitkadash, if he had any sense of his impending death. And I shared in an article in the Jewish Journal that I spent many hours with him in the August before he passed away. So I do feel he had an uncanny sense, although he wasn't really ill at the time, that he had far less time than he had. And he really wanted that out to be something of a living statement. Marcia, you said it so beautifully, of the complexity of the muse. And I wish I remembered exactly what you said when we see the transcript, because I think you got that combination just right. Somebody also asked about evil and Buddhism. I just want to remind people, again, this is from my personal speaking with Leonard, he really saw himself as a Lurianic Kabbalist, meaning there's a brokenness in the divine, a brokenness in us. Marcia, you talked about the Sitra Achra in your book, and the Sitra Achra, in the sense that, as Moshe indicated, is not just the absence of God. There's actually an active force that creates the Yetzer Hara that goes inside the human being. Marcia, we haven't really spoken about the Sitra Achra and the Yetzer Hara, though you did mention in the book. Would you mind just speaking a little bit about that as we come to the conclusion of our evening together?
The Cohen, actually, I just want to say one thing about the Buddhist question, because it comes up a lot. Of course, Leonard Cohen was a serious student of Buddhism, became a Buddhist monk, and spent 5 years in a Buddhist monastery. But he was also fairly clear that Buddhism was for him a practice and a discipline of the mind and of time, of how you discipline your mind and the hours of the days that you live, but that it wasn't his source for theistic or worldview, ontology, theology. He wasn't his source for the transcendent creator, the reason for why there is something rather than nothing. That for these, he went to the Judaism that he plumbed all his life, and also to the figure of Jesus, who was important for him. Babbage, a wonderful philosopher who has written a wonderful article about Cohen, she says Leonard Cohen went to the figure of Jesus not to become Christian, or not to preach to anybody to become Christian, but to get the point about Jesus. Mm-hmm. And I think she puts it exactly right. So these were his worldview, theistic sources for his struggles with our inability to be constant, though we know what we should be constant to. And then as to your question about this imagery, the Sitra Achra, these are so many of the images that Cohen used to try to get at that darkness that I mentioned, right? Yes, beauty, women, God, and darkness. And for him to find, where is that darkness? What is it that, and as Moshe said, that grips us? And we know it grips us. And we can't explain it away, and we certainly cannot pretend that it's going to go away. So what's left to the human task is to grapple with it. And the other side, the Sitra Achra, the other side, the dark side, he speaks from that dark side. But from that dark side, in that song and in that poem, he speaks of love from the other side. It is from going into the darkness of the other side, from your despair that you're never going to solve your own inconstancy. And from there, you have to work back to relationship, to commitment.
That's really, really beautifully put. It's in a way, both Moshe, your article on theodicy, and Marcia, your book on Leonard, has a sense of we have to stay, as it were, wrestling with the darkness. We don't resolve it, and you're the idea that we go into the darkness and come out an eye that can engage because we've gone through the breakage of the darkness. It's a little bit uncanny how, Moshe, your article on Job and Marcia, your book on Leonard, that I reviewed both this week, and it might just be a figment of my imagination, but it's as if they were speaking to each other. And I don't see Leonard as a Job character, other than, Moshe, as you pointed out, God doesn't come off looking so good in the book of Job. And toward the end of your book, Marcia, God doesn't come off looking so good in Leonard's theodicy theology either. Maybe that's for developed another time. And Moshe, any thoughts about that? Of looking at Leonard or looking at Job?
When I read Leonard's as a psalmist, as a liturgical voice, which is so powerful, it reminds me of a certain Talmudic passage, very powerful, that tells the following story, right? Moshe has these great adjectives, El HaGadol HaGibor VaNorah, right? The Almighty, the powerful, the awesome. And then the Talmud says that when Jeremiah saw that the Babylonians are destroying the city, he stopped saying Gibor. He didn't say the mighty, because it said, how can I say the mighty when the city is destroyed, when the people are slaughtered? And then when Daniel saw the further catastrophe, he stopped saying the awesome. And then the Talmud asks the following question: how could the prophets omit those attributes of praise from God? How could they dare? It looks blasphemous. And the Talmud says, Yodim nevi'im she'Elohem amiti ve'inam mechasvim bo. The prophets know that God is truth, and therefore they don't talk false towards him and to him. And I think Cohen captures that so powerfully. He's a heir of that tradition, right, of talking truth to God, because false praise is the hallmark of alienation, right? And if there was something, I mean, Marsha always challenged us. So what was constant there? What was constant in that movement? There is one thing that is constant, which is the commitment of the liturgical commitment of saying truth, right? As a right when in this powerful, I think maybe for me maybe one of the most powerful poems of Leonard, right? If it be your will, that's where Marcia's title comes from. If it be your will, and he says, if it be your will that a voice be true, right? If God's will is that the voice will be true, that resonates with that Talmudic passage, right? From this broken hill, I will sing to you, right? Not from the perfect hill, right? That broken hill that in some ways would not allow me to say how awesome you are, how heroic you are, how great you are, etc., etc. So that's I find in that respect as a true liturgical voice of a tradition that is very careful with false praise.
Yeah. I'm going
Moshe,
to jump in here because I'm so glad you brought up "If It Be Your Will," right from This Broken Hill. I Sing to You, the title of the book. It's exactly from our brokenness that Cohen didn't think we were ever getting out of, but the getting out of it is not the point. Mm-hmm. But one of the things I noticed is that he doesn't use the standard prayer form, "May it be," may God bring rain in the season, may God bring peace. And he uses "if it be your will." This is a real relationship. It's a question. Mm-hmm. What is your will? I'm not sure I get it. Mm-hmm. What is the truth? If it be your will to let me sing, if it be your will to make us well. Leonard Cohen was, for all his anger at God, in a real dialogue, a dialogical relationship with God. And he is asking here, what is God's will? Why do I think that I sometimes get it and then I lose it? Also the story of Cohen's life. Getting bond, getting commitment, getting relationship, losing it, missing it, trying to find it again.
Beautiful again. And just to combine these two, Moshe, your idea that he, and it were, speaks the truth, but it's a broken truth because of the limited nature of our being, and then speaking the truth into a God that from whom he can't fully hear the truth. However, he stays in relationship with his imperfect telling the truth and his imperfect hearing the truth. He doesn't walk away from this, from Marcia, as you say, the theology of relationality, which in a way stands for much of your thought. Well, I think we've used up our time, and it's been extraordinarily well used. It's for me such an honor, Moshe. I'm been enjoying your work for more than 20 years, and I think the only thing more vast in your erudition, Moshe, is your humanity and your heart, and that comes through everything that you write. Marcia, I'll just say it to you again. I don't want to embarrass you, but I began to read your book. I sat up and I said, "Oh, this one's different. This is special. There's something going on here." Leonard would have loved the scrutiny, the respect that you paid to him, that you wanted to figure him out and make him speak. And I think your last chapter was just so lyrical and so beautiful. He would have been, I think, brought to tears by your devotion to him as a thinker. So, Marcia, I'll let you have the last word here.
My deep thanks to both of you and Mordechai. Saying that Leonard Cohen might have thought something well about my book and my struggles with his struggles and my admiration for his poetic genius is very, very important to me.
Yeah.
And Moshe, as always, thank you. Thank you for teaching me so much, and thank you for being here. Mordechai, it's been wonderful meeting you, and we will continue the conversation.
This conversation has to continue. We're not done with studying Leonard Cohen. I can tell we've just touched the surface here. All right, so I'm going to turn over to the Streicker people to bring this on home. And Moshe, again, huge honor. Marcia, huge honor, and thank you to the Streicker Center for bringing this really great gift to everybody who's been here tonight. Shalom uvracha. Peace and blessings to everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for a wonderful and discussion, and we all learned a lot. Thank you. Good night.